and you hear the opposite in the Western media repeatedly. I want to play this here. 41. NATO says Putin is not preparing for peace. He's launching new offensives. But he says the training of the Russians is not the same level as the Ukrainian forces. When I heard this, I failed to believe that somehow the Russian army is not as adequately trained as the Ukrainians. It just doesn't make any sense. It defies logic. Play cut 41.
Almost 1 year since the invasion, President Putin is not preparing for peace. He is launching new offensives. So we must continue to provide Ukraine with what it needs to win. What Russia lacks in quality, they try to compensate in quantity. The training don't have the same level as the Ukrainian forces, but they have more forces. And the Russians are willing to send in those forces and take a high number of casualties.
Colonel, your reaction?
This is material that could be lifted from any history book about the Soviet Army in 1942, 43, 44, where they very definitely did what Mr. Stoltenberg describes. Doesn't apply today, not at all. In fact, quite the opposite. The second point is Mr. Putin cannot prepare for peace. I'm sure that he would prefer to do so, as everybody involved in this would. The problem is that we continue to promise more and more equipment, more ammunition, more tanks, better tanks, fighter aircraft, you name it, telling the Ukrainians to fight on to the bitter end. Under those circumstances, what do you expect the Russians to do? The Russians are doing what they know they have to do. They have to destroy the Ukrainian armed forces. That's what they're getting ready to complete right now.
How do you think the West is going to respond if and when Russia is able to take more territory?
I think the West will scream and holler, but ultimately do nothing. They understand the risks are enormous. If we interfere with ground forces, air forces in the war in Ukraine, we will end up in a direct confrontation with Russia. No one in the Department of Defense wants that, and everyone in the Department of Defense has warned the president we're not prepared for that confrontation.
That's fascinating. I hope you're right, Colonel. I hope that the West backs off and doesn't want to continue to escalate this. I've not seen any evidence of that so far. It seems that we're willing to send $100 billion in sophisticated armaments and weaponry, and I sure hope that there's some sort of negotiated peace settlement and ceasefire. What would a peace structure look like, and who could negotiate that?
The first thing is there can be no preconditions to peace talks. In other words, we've got to sit down with the Russians without any demands of any kind. We've got to listen to them. Then we have to respond and hammer out something that will ultimately serve everyone's interests. And no one is going to come out of this with everything that they want. One thing is absolutely certain, and that is that we have to sign up for neutrality for Ukraine. That's absolutely non-negotiable. And it's in our interest, Charlie, to do that. A neutral Ukraine between Russia and NATO is a wonderful buffer that both sides can appreciate. But other than that, when it comes to territory, that's going to be a give and take. It's going to be determined, I suspect, in large part by where the Russian forces are when we finally decide to negotiate. And of course, that's a bad way to do business on our side, because we have to expect that the Russians will ultimately roll everything up to the Dnieper River.
I'm afraid that a lot of people are going to continually unnecessarily die, and it's only going to put us in a more and more precarious situation. So, Colonel, I want to ask you about the unidentified flying objects. What do you know about this, and how should we think about it?
Well, I wouldn't waste a great deal of time on it. I think the whole balloon hysteria is coming unglued right now. As I understand it, we're now close to admitting that we shot down a weather balloon that belonged to the U.S. Weather Service. I'm not sure, but I wouldn't be surprised. One of my friends, a classmate from West Point, called me and said, Doug, these people are so stupid. We could buy a balloon online, fill it with helium, attach a teddy bear to it, put a Chinese flag in the teddy bear's hand, and they'd use a $400,000 missile to shoot it down. I mean, this has reached the point of absurdity. The Chinese have 300 satellites orbiting the planet. At least a third of those have a military application. They have access to the same technologies of intelligence collection that we do. They can read the names on gravestones. They can listen to whatever Dr. Jill says to President Biden tonight when they go to sleep. So who are we kidding? Why would they need a balloon to do anything? I think this has been maybe at best a distraction and at worst an embarrassment.
So this weekend was the Super Bowl and the players' management, waste management, and I live nearby, and I saw the Goodyear balloon. And then, right as the Super Bowl was beginning, there was a major flyover. I said, they're going to shoot down the Goodyear balloon. I know it. They're going to shoot it down.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the Goodyear blimp, because for any of these balloons to carry a payload of technology that would actually provide the kind of surveillance that we're looking for, or that the Chinese were looking for, it would have to be the size of a Goodyear blimp. And these things have all been far, far too small to do that.
So do you think this is overblown? Is it our own government being incompetent against itself? Has this been happening for some time? Is this a threat to the homeland? What's your conclusion of it?
I think someone in the Air Force saw this thing and said, well, it's probably a weather balloon, or they're accustomed to it and did nothing. And then we decided, and when I say we, I suspect the Biden administration, to make something out of it. Is it incompetence? Probably some of that. I don't think that the North American Air Defense Command is incompetent. I don't think the commander is. I don't think he reacted, because we've seen lots of trash blow at 30, 40,000 feet along the jet stream from west to east for a long time. Somebody decided to make this an issue and pin it on China. There's a lot of Chinese hysteria in Washington right now, Charlie. Sometimes I wonder, since they've already made a mess of this war with Russia, and the Russians are ultimately going to triumph, and everybody here knows it, maybe now it's time to shift gears to China and start something else. I hope not, but sometimes I get that impression.
The appetite for war never ceases in the kingdom of Washington, D.C.
Welcome back to Neil Oliver Live. Now, the long-expected Russian spring offensive in Ukraine is underway, NATO reported last week. The eastern city of Bakhmut, among others in the east, has been under attack, and observers warn the Russian effort will be widely spread with multiple targets. On the 8th of February, Ukrainian President Zelensky spoke in Westminster Hall and asked for British fighter jets for his pilots. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and Labour leader Keir Starmer had earlier spoken in the Commons about their commitment to supporting Ukraine until victory is achieved. Just what are the prospects for the Ukraine in the days, weeks and months ahead? To consider that question is my next guest, retired US Colonel Douglas Macgregor, a decorated combat veteran and former advisor to the Secretary of Defence in the Trump administration. Good evening, Colonel. Thanks for joining me.
Sure.
First of all, Colonel, what is your assessment of the war in Ukraine at this time?
Right now, you have in and around Ukraine roughly 700,000 Russian troops. The major body of these troops are located down in southern Ukraine and in western Russia. Most of these troops are new in the sense that they're mobilized or recruited, but they are all commanded by experienced combat veterans. In front of them right now are highly elite light infantry formations backed by massive strike assets, clearing the remaining areas through which these massive forces will shortly pass. It's almost finished, not quite. Bakhmut, which has been under attack for months and has literally bled the Ukrainian army white, is close to being annihilated. But other than that, most of these forces are ready to go. It's simply a question of when the general staff in Moscow gives the green light. And by the way, their targets for their missile strikes have changed dramatically. They've stripped away virtually all the remaining air defense that the Ukrainians have.